beaten and bleeding against the saloon wall. She begged 40 men who wouldn't move, "Please, somebody, help me." No one there would believe what walked through that door next. A wanted man about to tear the whole rotten scheme apart with nothing but a small leather book and 2 dark gloves he never took off. The crack of a fist against a woman's face has a sound all its own. It isn't like a slammed door or a dropped plate. It cuts under the piano note that's playing, and it goes flat against every wall in the room. And for 1/2 of 1 second, 40 men in the Larkspur saloon stopped breathing at the same time. That's the part nobody likes to talk about afterward, not the fist. Though looking away, she hit the wall hard enough that a nail meant for a coat hook tore through her sleeve and opened her shoulder. The floor tilted up at her like it meant to swallow her whole, and she held herself off it by fixing her eyes on one point across the room that wasn't the man who'd hit her, and wasn't the banker who'd ordered it, and wasn't the 40 faces pretending their beer was suddenly very interesting. It was the door. The door was opening. But that isn't where this story starts. To understand why a woman with blood running into her collar was the most dangerous person in that room, more dangerous in her own way than the man who could still put a bullet through a coin at 40 paces, and a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated by men who never once bothered to check her arithmetic. If this is your first time on this channel, find the subscribe button before you go any further. We tell stories like this every week, and you don't want to walk in during the second act and miss how it started. 3 weeks earlier, Omaha, Nebraska. Late August 1881. Maren Hale had spent 6 years behind the counter at Whitfield & Sons Dry Goods, 4 of them stocking shelves and wrapping parcels for customers who never once learned her name. Because the previous bookkeeper had quit without notice, and nobody else in the building could make a column of figures balance. Maren could make them balance in her head before she ever picked up a pencil. She was 29 years old. She had buried her mother in the spring, a long, slow illness that had eaten most of 2 years, and every dollar Maren had managed to set aside, and, with her mother gone, there was nothing left in Omaha that owed her anything, and nothing she owed back. She was not a woman who ran on sentiment. She had tried it once in her 20s, with a store clerk who had promised her a house and a garden, and had instead left town owing 3 separate creditors, Maren's small savings among them, and she had found sentiment, after that an unreliable instrument, the kind that shows a person what she wants to be true, rather than what actually is. Numbers didn't do that. Numbers held still, and let you check them as many times as you needed to be sure. She had come to prefer the company of things that held still, and in 6 years nobody in Omaha had thought to ask her why a young woman with a good face and a sharp mind hadn't married. They had simply decided among themselves that she was particular, and let it go at that. There was a rhythm to her days that most people in Omaha found dull, and Maren found, privately, almost peaceful. She opened the store at 6. She swept the boardwalk out front before the first customers arrived. She spent her lunch hour, more often than not, working through whatever column had refused to balance the day before, eating a cold biscuit at her desk rather than joining the other clerks at the corner cafe, where they traded gossip she had no particular use for. Her employer, old Mr. Taggs. Whitfield once joked, half in earnest, that she'd have made a fine lawyer if the law schools had any interest in taking women. And her answer, given without any humor in it at all, was that she'd rather find the lie in a ledger than argue one in front of a jury. He didn't bring it up again after that, though he raised her wages the following month regardless. The letter from Wyatt Calloway arrived 9 days after the funeral, forwarded through a Lonely Hearts correspondence a cousin in Lincoln had talked her into 2 winters back, and which Maren had mostly ignored ever since, answering perhaps 1 letter in 5 and never with any real intention behind it. Wyatt ran 140 acres of grazing land on the eastern edge of a small Colorado high country town named Larkspur, and he was looking, in his own careful words, for a wife of practical disposition, not a sweetheart, not a beauty, a partner who could keep a household running the way he kept a fence line running, without waste. What persuaded her wasn't romance. She'd have distrusted romance, dressed up in a letter from a man she'd never laid eyes on. It was the way he wrote. He didn't describe himself as lonely, though a man alone on 140 acres for 6 years, plainly was he described his land instead, the grade of the north pasture after a wet spring, the exact number of fence posts he'd had to reset following a hard winter, and the exact cost of the cedar to reset them. A man who kept that kind of accounting on his own fence line was a man who paid attention to the world around him in the same way Maren did, and she respected attention above nearly every other quality a person could carry. They exchanged 5 letters across 6 weeks, each one a little longer and a little warmer than the last, though neither of them ever strayed far from practical matters: the price of cattle, the coming winter, a new well he was having dug closer to the house. In the 5th letter, almost as an aside, tucked between a line about the well and a line about the price of flour in town, Wyatt mentioned a name the way a careful man mentions a storm he's been watching, billed on the horizon but hasn't yet said out loud, a piece of equipment financing he'd taken through a local banker, almost apologetic note about how the terms of it had somehow shifted twice since the papers were first drawn up, though he couldn't quite say where the change had crept in. He wrote it off in the letter as his own poor memory for figures, and moved on to ask her whether she preferred a house with a covered porch. Maren filed that paragraph in the part of her mind she kept for things that did not fully close. She had a great many things filed there over the years. An inventory shortfall at the dry goods store that had never been explained, a customer's account that had somehow paid itself off twice in the same month, and every single one of them, sooner or later, had turned out to matter. She wrote back to Wyatt that same evening, and did something she had never once done in 5 previous letters. She asked a direct question of her own, rather than simply answering his. She asked him plainly whether the terms of his equipment loan were recorded anywhere beyond Cobb's own paperwork, and whether he had ever thought to ride the 2 days to the Territorial Land Office in Denver and check the county's copy against what Cobb had shown him. His answering letter, the 6th, arrived a full 10 days later than his usual pace, apologetic about the delay, blaming a busy roundup season, and mentioning almost in passing that he intended to make that very trip to Denver himself before the first snow came. That letter was the last one Maren ever received from Wyatt Calloway. She had already boarded the stage west before she had any reason to wonder why a 7th never came. She packed a single carpet bag and a small leather notebook her grandmother had carried over from Norway 40 years before, and had always known, in the old language, as the Baka. Simply the word for the book, though to Maren it had never meant any book but that one. Inside its covers were her grandmother's own figures from half a century of a hard immigrant life kept scrupulously honest in tight, cramped columns. And behind them, page after page Maren had filled herself since she was 9 years old, even when it manages to hide everywhere else. She boarded the westbound stage at dawn on the 1st of September, sharing the coach with a preacher's wife, bound for Cheyenne, and a cattle buyer, who talked at length about beef prices and asked nothing at all about her own business. 3 days on that road wore a person down in ways no letter had ever warned her about. The coach rocking hard enough over the rutted stretches west of the Platte to bruise a shoulder against the window frame. A night spent at a relay station so cold the water in the basin had a skin of ice on it by morning. Half-day's delay outside a small town named Sterling, while a wheel was repaired by a blacksmith who took his time about it and charged double for the trouble of a Sunday. She did not know, watching the flat black Nebraska cornfields give slowly way to Colorado's high, dry grass through a window fogged with 3 days of other people's breath and dust, that Wyatt Calloway had already been dead for 8 days, and had been dead, in fact, since 2 full days before his own 5th letter had even reached her hand in Omaha. A detail that would matter a great deal later, though she had no way yet to know it. Larkspur announced itself before it ever came into view. Coal smoke first, then cattle, then a fine grit of dust that settled into the back of the throat, like it fully intended to stay there. What waited for her at the depot was not a rancher with careful opinions about cedar fence posts. It was a man in a gray suit with a gold watch chain that caught far more light than the overcast afternoon had any business producing. Standing very still in a way that suggested he had been standing there, watching the road for some time before the stage ever rolled into sight. He held his hat against his chest in a gesture built to look respectful, and somehow managed instead to look calculated, though Maren couldn't yet have told anyone precisely why. "Miss Hale," he said, and introduced himself as Wendell Cobb, the very name from the bottom of Wyatt's 5th letter. "Fever," he told her, with the practiced gentleness of a man who had delivered this particular news before 9 days back. A more careful reckoning, Maren thought, without a single flicker crossing her face, would have made it 11, given the postmark still folded in her carpet bag. She noted the discrepancy the way she noted every discrepancy in a stranger's arithmetic, quietly, without comment, and filed it in the same column as everything else that did not close. Then, without so much as a pause to let her grieve a man she had never once laid eyes on, Cobb produced a document from his breast pocket, already unfolded, already waiting. A loan of $475 secured against Wyatt Calloway's land, the whole 140 acres reverting to the Cobb Land and Banking Company should the borrower die without a recognized heir. The notarization stamp at the bottom of the page belonged to Cobb's own office. Maren read it twice, standing right there on the depot platform with her bag still in hand and the westbound stage's dust not yet settled behind her. Then she had 3 questions ready before Cobb had even finished refolding his handkerchief back into his breast pocket. What was the rate of interest on the loan? Who exactly had witnessed the signing of it? And was the transfer of that land recorded in the county registry, or only in the private ledger of the Cobb Land and Banking Company, because those 2 things were not remotely the same institution? Something moved behind Cobb's face at the 3rd question, not his expression. His expression stayed pleasant and practiced through the whole exchange, the face of a man well used to delivering bad news gently. Something underneath it shifted instead, the way a riverbed moves when the water above it changes course and the surface hasn't caught up to the change quite yet. "I'll need to think on it," she told him, and thanked him kindly for meeting the stage on such short notice, and carried her own bag across the muddy street to the rooming house without waiting for him to offer to carry it for her, which he had clearly expected to do and had already reached halfway toward. She sat on the edge of a narrow rooming house bed that evening, still in her traveling dress, and went back through everything Cobb had said, in the exact order he'd said it, the way she had once gone back through a column of figures a customer swore was wrong and found eventually the one transposed number. The numbers didn't close. Somewhere in that tidy little speech on the depot platform there was a missing entry, and in 6 years of bookkeeping, Maren Hale had never once found a missing entry that turned out in the end to be an honest accident. The rooming house sat 2 doors down from the Cobb House Hotel, close enough that Maren could see its lamplit windows from her own narrow one, and close enough, too, that she learned within her first 2 days exactly how the town talked about the man who owned it. The woman who ran the rooming house, a widow named Agnes Pruitt, who had buried a husband of her own to a fever some winters back, mentioned Wendell Cobb only once, unprompted, while pouring Maren's morning coffee, and then changed the subject so fast it was clear she regretted having said even that much. What she'd said was small, that Cobb had been the only man in 3 counties willing to lend money to a rancher short on cash after a bad season, and that half the town owed him something or other, and that the other half had learned a long while back not to ask too many questions about how a small-town banker had built himself a hotel and a stake in half the grazing land north of Larkspur in under a decade. Maren thanked her for the coffee and filed that too. He rode in from the west 2 mornings after she arrived, and Larkspur registered his arrival, the way certain towns register certain men, a general tightening in the air along the main street, conversations dropping half a register without anyone quite deciding to lower their voice, eyes sliding toward the notice board outside the marshal's office, and then away again fast, before anyone could be caught looking too long. The paper pinned to that board was 4 years old and had gone soft and yellow at the corners from 4 summers of sun. The name printed under a rough sketch was Tate. The charge was arson and assault. $250 posted for him, dead or alive. Enough money to be worth a serious man's trouble, not quite enough to pull the truly dangerous hunters down out of the mountains after him. He looked to be somewhere near 40, dressed in a dark coat that had been fine once, years back, and had since been worn down to purely functional, its collar gone soft and its buttons replaced with ones that didn't quite match. He wore a pair of gloves the color of old tobacco leaf that he did not remove, not at the livery when he settled his horse, not at the water trough when he splashed his face, not lifting a cup of coffee at a corner table of the Cobb House Hotel where Maren had by then taken on cleaning work 3 afternoons a week, because it was the one respectable reason a new woman in town could have for spending hours at a stretch inside that particular building. He looked at her exactly once across the dining room, over the rim of that coffee cup. Not the way most men in that town looked at a new face working the halls of a hotel, not appraising, not curious in the ordinary sense. The way a man looks at someone whose whole situation he has already privately worked out for himself, has already formed a considered opinion about, and hasn't yet decided whether he means to share it with anyone. Then he looked away and went back to his coffee as if the moment had never happened, and Maren filed that look in the same column as the missing 11 days, and went on with her sweeping. 3 evenings later, carrying a tray of coffee down the hotel's back hallway, she passed close enough to his open door to see him seated at the small writing table inside, working through a stack of old newspapers with a slow, deliberate patience that surprised her. but something closer to what she herself did, with a column of figures that refused to balance. He glanced up once, caught her looking, and gave the smallest possible nod, the kind exchanged between two people who each recognize, without a word passing between them, that the other is working on something private and is owed the courtesy of not being asked about it. She carried the tray on down the hallway and didn't slow her step, and neither of them mentioned the moment again, though she found herself thinking of it more than once over the following days. She heard the rest of what the town knew about him in pieces, the way a person hears everything in a place that size, one overheard remark at a time. The bartender at the saloon claimed he'd once seen Tate ride 3 days out of his way to return a stray dog to a homestead he'd passed only once, a week earlier, simply because he'd remembered the brand on the fence post. A stable hand swore the warrant was wrong on its face, that the fire it described had started in a barn Tate had been nowhere near that night, and that the property owner who'd sworn out the complaint against him had, by strange coincidence, nobody in Larkspur seemed to know for certain which parts of what they'd heard were true, and which had simply grown taller with each telling, the way stories about wanted men always did. But Maren noticed that not one person she spoke to, not even the ones repeating the ugliest version of the story, seemed to actually believe he'd done what the papers said. The hotel's account books lived in a cabinet in the back office, behind a lock built on the very same mechanism as her grandmother's old sewing chest back in Omaha, a chest Maren had first picked open with a hairpin at the age of 9, and had gotten a hard swat for her trouble when she was caught. It had taken her most of a rainy afternoon to manage it back then. It took her 6 seconds now, on the third night after Cobb's clerks had gone home for the evening, and the hallway lamps had burned down low and orange. She wasn't hunting for anything in particular. She was hunting the way she always hunted, for the shape of a discrepancy. And a discrepancy has a particular kind of stillness around it once a person has spent enough years learning to recognize the feeling of it. The front ledger, the one anybody in town could walk in and ask to see, was ordinary, aggressively, deliberately ordinary, the kind of tidy, unremarkable ordinary that takes real, sustained effort to maintain over years. But behind it, tucked at the very back of the cabinet, under a stack of old receipts nobody had touched in a decade, sat a second book. Smaller than the first, bound in dark leather gone soft and worn with handling. Not a hotel ledger at all. A private record of land transfers, 11 of them, stretching back 9 years to entries written in a younger, less confident version of the same careful hand. Every entry carried the same architecture, repeated 11 times with the discipline of a man who trusted his own system completely. A name, a brief description of the property, a loan figure, 2 dates, one for the loan and one left blank until it could be filled in, and a cause of death, written down with the flat, bureaucratic calm of a man who understood perfectly well that ordinary language is its own kind of hiding place. Fever. An accident at a river crossing. 'Cause unknown. Drowning. Fever again a second time for a different family entirely, 3 years later, as though the word itself had simply become convenient. Each transfer to the Cobb Land and Banking Company had completed within 10 to 16 days of the recorded date of death, give or take a day either direction. Close enough across 11 separate entries that no honest coincidence could explain it. One entry, the 6th, belonged to a family named Ostrander, a widow and 2 young sons who had held 40 acres north of town, according to the description, good bottom land along a creek. Maren sat with that single word for a long moment before she moved on to the 7th entry, because she had passed a boy on the street 2 days before, thin and quiet, sweeping the boardwalk outside the mercantile for pennies, and she had no way to know if it was the same family. A 2nd entry, the 9th, gave her pause for a different reason. It belonged to a man named Absalom Reiner, whose 80 acres had run along the same creek 2 parcels down from the Ostranders, and whose listed cause of death was drowning. A strange enough thing on its own for a man the county record still described, 3 lines up, as having lived his whole life within sight of that creek, and having crossed it on horseback 1,000 times without incident. The transfer to the Cobland and Banking Company in his case had completed in exactly 11 days, and the witness named on the notarized loan document was, Maren noted with a small, cold jolt of recognition. She copied both entries with the same steady hand. She copied every other. But she sat a while longer with those 2 names than she had with the rest, because a pattern on paper is one thing, and a pattern with a widow's face and a sweeping boy attached to it, that she could no longer pretend it was only the first kind she was dealing with. By the time she'd finished copying the last of the 11 entries, the lamp oil had burned down to almost nothing, and Maren allowed herself, for the first time since stepping off the stage, a long moment simply to sit with what she now knew in full. 9 years, 11 families. One careful hand behind every column, filling in blanks as they came due the way a farmer fills in a planting calendar, patient and unhurried and confident that no one was ever going to look closely enough to notice the rhythm of it. She thought about riding straight for the county seat that very night and decided against it before the thought had even finished forming. A lone woman on a strange road in the dark, carrying evidence against the richest man in the territory, was a greater risk than a woman quietly finishing her shift at his hotel for one more day, while she worked out the safest way to put what she knew into hands that could actually use it. Patience had served her through every column she'd ever balanced. She saw no reason to abandon it now, with the stakes finally raised. This high Wyatt Calloway was the 12th entry. The transfer date beside his name sat blank, a small, empty space waiting patiently to be filled in, the way the other 11 had once waited before someone finally closed them. Taking, it would have announced, the very next morning, that she had found it, and that announcement would have collapsed whatever little time she had left to act. Instead, over 3 careful hours by a low lamp, she copied every entry into the bokeh in her own hand, every column heading, every date, every interval between a death and the paperwork that followed it, checking each figure twice against the original. Then she set the leather ledger back exactly as she had found it, down to the precise angle it had rested against the cabinet wall, relocked the cabinet with the same 6 seconds of work it had taken to open it, and carried what she now knew back to her narrow room above the mercantile. She read her own copied handwriting 3 times over before she finally blew out the lamp, until the whole pattern had settled into shape in her mind, the way a column finally balances after the last correction. Not as horror anymore, she had crossed past horror, somewhere around the 8th name, the way a person crosses past shock into something colder and more usable, as evidence plainly stated. A pattern, regular enough, across 9 years, to have a structure sitting behind it. A structure consistent enough to have a single deliberate author standing over the whole of it. What would you have done sitting in that small rented room with that book in your hands and 11 ruined families written out in a stranger's own careful hand? Would you have found the first eastbound stage the next morning and never looked back at Larkspur again? Or would you have stayed with the lamp burning past midnight and kept writing until you had something no circuit judge in the whole territory could ever set aside? Tell us in the comments what you'd have done. We read every single one. Maren went looking for Marshal Owen Bell on a Friday evening, which anyone in Larkspur could have told her, had she asked, was a poor time to expect to find him behind his own desk, and she did not find him there. She had the bokeh tucked inside her coat, pressed flat against her ribs, where she could feel its weight with every step, and she had not planned on making any kind of scene. She had planned, carefully, methodically, to place what she knew into the hands of a man wearing a badge before Judge Alden Prescott's circuit rode into town the following morning, because she had worked the logic all the way through the night before. Wendell Cobb would find some way to stop her from reaching that judge directly, unless a lawman was already holding her evidence first, in writing, with witnesses to the handing over. What she had not accounted for in all her careful working through of the logic was Wendell Cobb being in the saloon that particular evening at the particular corner table where Marshal Bell nursed his regular Friday whiskey. Cobb hadn't expected her either, not walking through that door at that hour, and Maren watched 3 full seconds of open recalculation cross his face before he found his voice, 3 seconds in which the whole crowded room was already watching. Because a respectable working woman walking alone into that particular establishment at that particular hour was an event on its own account before a single word ever got said aloud. What he said next, she heard almost from a distance, the way a person hears things underwater, muffled and slow. Something about her employment at his hotel. Something about private business records not being any concern of a hired cleaning girl. Something about women and legal matters, and the proper order such things ought to follow in a decent, well-run frontier town. It was not a private threat delivered quietly between the two of them. It was a performance, aimed squarely at every man drinking in that room. He was laying down his own version of the evening before she could ever lay down hers, because the first story told in a crowded room carries a natural advantage. 40 men had stopped their own conversations to listen by then, though not one of them had moved from his stool or his corner table. A cattle drover near the door studied the bottom of his empty glass like it had suddenly become the most interesting object in the territory. 2 ranch hands who'd been arguing cheerfully about a horse race an hour earlier went silent and found somewhere else to look. Even the piano player's hands had stilled over the keys, waiting, the way the whole room seemed to be waiting, for someone else to be the one who spoke first, or moved first, or did anything at all besides watch. He had badly, fatally misjudged what she had already done with the 2 days behind her. She had just opened her mouth to answer him plainly, when his hand moved not toward her at all, toward the arm of the big man standing beside him. Garrett Boone was broad through the shoulders and not a man given to reflection of any kind, and he read that small private gesture exactly the way it was meant to be read, and swung his fist without a second's hesitation. The sound of his knuckles against Maren Hale's face was the sound this whole story opened with, the sound that cut clean under the last note of the piano and went flat against every wall in the room. The coat hook nail tore through her sleeve and opened the skin of her shoulder beneath it. The floor tilted up toward her, and every one of the 40 men in that room either looked down into his own drink or looked for one unguarded second toward the door, because the door at the back of the room had just begun, very slowly. He didn't come through it fast. He didn't come through it with a hand already resting on the iron at his hip, or with any of the theater a man puts on when he has rehearsed his own entrance somewhere in front of a mirror. Tate came through that door the way a man comes through a door, when he already knows everything waiting for him on the other side of it, when he has been standing outside in the cold long enough to hear exactly what was happening inside and has already worked through every response available to a man in his position, and is quietly settled on the one he intends to use slow, both hands open and plainly visible at his sides. The tobacco-dark gloves catching the low amber light thrown off the overhead lanterns, exactly the way they had caught it in the very first image this whole story opened on, because that image was real, every part of it, and this was the precise moment it came from. He stopped just past the doorway and let the whole room take him in. He let the wanted notice every man in that saloon had walked past 100 times that year do its own quiet work in their memory, 4 years old and yellowed, and never quite as ignored as anyone pretended. Then, into a silence you could have poured out like water, he said Wendell Cobb's name plain, flat, and unmistakable. Not a shout, not even loud. The kind of quiet that carries clean across a room precisely because everyone in it has already stopped making a sound of their own, it said without a single word wasted on top of it. I know exactly what this is. I know exactly what you are, and every soul standing in this room is about to watch us both admit it out loud, together, right now. Cobb's face moved through 4 separate expressions in the space of about 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, something closer to fear, and, finally, a thin, brittle attempt at composure that fooled nobody left in that room. Maren, her shoulder bleeding steadily into the torn seam of her coat, watched every one of those 4 expressions pass from where she'd landed against the wall, and understood with the same cold clarity she had always brought to a stubborn column of figures that the 5th thing to happen in that room was going to have to be hers to do, and she pushed herself off the wall on unsteady legs. She reached inside her coat, into the inner pocket that had carried the Boca through 3 weeks and 11 names in one long stagecoach ride west across 2 states, and she pulled it free and laid it open, deliberately, on the very table where Marshall Bell's whiskey glass still sat sweating faintly in the lamplight. That was what she had been reaching for back at the very start of this story. That was the thing nobody in that room, least of all Wendell Cobb, had ever once seen coming. The whole room looked at the marshal, looking at them. Tate hadn't moved another step from the doorway. He didn't need to. Something had already shifted in that room, one of those invisible transfers of weight that happens in a crowded space the instant the power inside it stops belonging to whoever walked in the door, holding it a few minutes before. Maren spoke without raising her voice above what it took to be heard clearly at the marshal's table. She said the book in front of him held copies, made in her own hand, of entries taken from a private ledger kept in Wendell Cobb's own back cabinet. That those entries recorded 11 separate land transfers, each one completing within 10 to 16 days of the listed owner's death, going back 9 years. That the 12th entry in that ledger bore the name Wyatt Calloway, and the transfer date beside his name was still blank, because Wyatt Calloway had died a free man on land nobody yet had any legal right to. That Judge Prescott would be riding into Larkspur by mid-morning on his regular circuit, and that she intended, with or without the marshal's help, to place these very pages directly into his hands before the sun was fully up. Then, turning to Marshall Bell alone, without so much as a glance toward either Boone or Cobb, She asked plainly that the assault against her be entered into his book that night by name, while every man in the room could still bear witness to it. The marshal reached for his pencil without a word. Word of what happened in that saloon travels fast through a town the size of Larkspur, faster than any rider could carry it, and this next part is worth sitting with a moment before we go on. If Maren's story pulled you in the way, it pulled that whole room. Become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name to keep stories like hers coming. Judge Alden Prescott read through Maren's copied pages without a flicker of expression the following morning, seated at the same corner table where the whiskey glass had sat the night before, now cleared away. When he finished, he went back and read 3 particular pages a second time, slower, his finger tracing down each column of dates. A county deputy reached Cobb's own office before any warning of what had happened in the saloon could possibly travel there ahead of him. The original ledger was still sitting exactly where Maren had left it 3 nights before, because Wendell Cobb had never once imagined a woman who kept her own books that carefully, and had certainly never imagined those very books already sitting in a circuit judge's hands before he'd finished pouring his own coffee that morning. The 3 witnesses whose names Maren had quietly noted from the margins of that second ledger were brought before Judge Prescott within 2 hours of being sent for, and each one, once asked plainly, had a story of his own that lined up with the dates in the book almost to the day. Agnes Pruitt herself was one of the 3. It turned out she'd witnessed a signing years back that she had never fully understood at the time, and had never once been asked about since, and she told the judge everything she remembered, plainly, without once looking toward the jail cell where Cobb sat listening through the bars. When the balance of power in a small town finally does tip, the people who have been waiting quietly for years for it to tip tend to move a great deal faster than anyone watching from the outside would ever expect them to. Judge Prescott asked Maren only one question directly, once the witnesses had finished and the room had mostly cleared. He asked her how a hotel cleaning girl had come to know with such precision exactly which cabinet to open and exactly what she was looking for once she'd opened it. Maren answered him the same way she answered everything, without embellishment and without apology, that she had kept another man's books for 6 years before she ever set foot in Larkspur, and that a woman who has spent that long learning what an honest ledger looks like develops a very particular feeling for what a dishonest one looks like too. And that feeling, once a person has it, does not simply switch off because the books in question happen to belong to someone dangerous. The judge studied her for a long moment after that answer, and then made a note in his own book, and did not ask her anything further. By early afternoon, Wendell Cobb sat in the small Larkspur jail behind the marshal's office, still in his gray suit, the gold watch chain confiscated along with everything else in his pockets. His accounts at his own bank were frozen by the judge's order before he had finished protesting his innocence to anyone still willing to stand near enough to listen. A list of 11 ruined families was being assembled that same afternoon, name by name, directly out of the same soft leather ledger he had believed, right up until 3 nights before, was locked safely away where nobody would ever think to go looking. In that same brief written order, in a plain, unhurried hand, Judge Prescott vacated the 4-year-old warrant against the man calling himself Tate. 2 short lines, noting for the record that the original complaint had been sworn before a notary whose entire authority, which rendered the whole instrument void from the very day it had first been filed. 4 years of a bounty riding on his shoulders undone in the space of 2 sentences by the same kind of careful, patient reading that had just undone Wendell Cobb. The wanted notice came down off the board outside the marshal's office early the next morning, before most of the town was even up and about. Nobody ever quite agreed afterward on exactly who had taken it down. Some figures, once you finally set the right 2 of them side by side, simply close on their own and don't need an audience to do it. Maren found Tate at the livery 2 mornings later, saddling a horse that wasn't his own. A horse the marshal had quietly arranged to see he rode out on, since the last one that had ever carried his name had been sold off years before, back when a standing bounty had made owning any property of his own too dangerous a thing to bother with for long. Her arm sat in a clean sling by then. Her shoulder had been stitched the night before by the same town doctor who had, a day earlier, looked over Cobb's other 11 entries and gone very quiet for a long moment before saying anything at all. She thanked him. Not with any long speech, that wasn't in her nature, any more than sentiment ever had been. Just a plain, direct thank you, delivered the same unhurried way she delivered everything, like a figure she had checked twice already and found, at last, satisfactory. He touched the brim of his hat in answer, told her in about as few words as she'd used herself that she would have gotten there without him standing in that doorway at all. She'd already had the book open on the table before he ever said a single name out loud. He'd only been the reason the room stopped moving long enough to let her lay it down properly. 4 years is a long time to carry a name that wasn't true, she said, watching him check the cinch on a horse that wasn't his. He considered that for a moment, the way a man considers a fact he's turned over a great many times already and never quite finished with. Long enough to get particular about which rooms I walk into, he answered, and let it lie there unadorned. The closest thing to an explanation he seemed inclined to offer for a habit of watching doorways that would likely never fully leave him now. She didn't ask him to stay in Larkspur, and she understood, in the same clear, unclouded way, she understood a column of numbers that he had never once considered offering to. A man who has spent 4 years with a bounty finally lifted from his shoulders does not linger long in the town that lifted it for him, however grateful that town might now be, and however many hands wanted to shake his on the street. He had a long, worn habit of moving on first and thinking it over later, and nothing about the last 3 days had changed that habit, only perhaps made the road ahead of him a little less crowded with men looking to collect $250 for turning him in. He rode out west at first light the following morning, alone, the tobacco-colored gloves resting easy and unhurried on the reins, and nobody in Larkspur ever laid eyes on him again after that, though for years afterward, so the story went, whenever a stranger walked into that particular saloon slow, with both hands showing plainly and something unhurried in the way he crossed a crowded room. Somebody, leaning on the bar, would go quiet for a moment and remember exactly why. Judge Prescott, before he rode on to the next town on his own long circuit, asked her to serve as the county's official recording clerk for the land office, a position that had, right up until that week, been handled almost entirely out of the back room of the Cobb Land and Banking Company, which was precisely how 11 separate families had managed to lose everything they owned without a single county official ever once noticing the pattern sitting in plain sight. Aaron accepted the post on one firm condition, stated as plainly as she'd once stated her 3 questions on the depot platform, that from that day forward, Every land transfer in that county would be checked against two entirely independent ledgers, kept by two different hands, before a single acre was ever allowed to change ownership. Nobody on the county board argued with her about it. Nobody who had watched what she'd done with one small leather notebook was inclined to argue with Maren Hale about anything involving a column of figures ever again, and word of that tended to travel just as fast as everything else had. If this story has stayed with you this far, that's worth saying out loud in the comments before you go. The men who wrote down the official history of towns like Larkspur mostly carried notary stamps in their pockets, not conscience, and stories like Maren's rarely made it into their version of how the West was settled. And if you haven't yet, this is a good moment to become a channel member. Tap Join right beside the channel name. It's a small thing on your end, and it's the reason stories like hers keep getting told at all. 11 families never got every acre of their land back whole, not all at once, and not without years of slow county court work picking apart exactly what Wendell Cobb had spent 9 years quietly building, and got the truth entered permanently into a county book, instead of left to rot in a private cabinet behind a hotel office, which was already more than most of them had dared to hope for the week before Maren Hale ever stepped off a westbound stage, expecting nothing more complicated than a quiet rancher. And 140 acres of well-kept fence line. The Ostrander widow got her 40 acres back within the year, once the courts finished with it, and the boy Maren had once passed sweeping the boardwalk for pennies went back to school that same autumn instead. Maren never made much of it to anyone, not even Agnes Pruitt, how much it had mattered to her personally to see that particular name crossed off the list of families still waiting, or how many evenings she'd sat with the bokeh open on her own kitchen table afterward, simply looking at the line where his family's entry had finally properly closed. News of what had happened in Larkspur traveled well beyond the county line before that first winter was out. A territorial newspaper out of Denver ran 3 columns on it under a headline about a bookkeeper who'd brought down a banker with nothing but a notebook and a cold nerve, and for a season or two afterward, Maren fielded letters from as far off as Cheyenne and Santa Fe. Other clerks and quiet, careful women writing to ask, in one form or another, how she'd found the courage to do what she'd done. Her answer to every one of them was the same honest one. There hadn't been much courage in it at all. Not the way people like to imagine courage. Mostly there had just been a column that refused to balance. The Cobland and Banking Company was broken up and sold off within 2 years. Its assets split 3 ways among the 11 families still owed something, and a pair of honest banks out of Denver willing to take on what remained. A new bank opened in the old building the following spring, and the county board, at Maren's quiet insistence, required its ledgers checked twice a year from then on by an outside clerk who answered to no one in Larkspur at all. Nobody ever had to ask twice who ought to hold that position for the first several years running. She kept the bokeh the rest of her life and went on adding to it. Somewhere in a Colorado county archive. Today, if a person knew exactly where to look, the handwriting on a particular page changes. Tighter, steadier, more deliberate, the hand of a woman who had already learned, long before, that Friday night in a crowded saloon, and that the surest way to bring down a man who trades in silence for a living is to simply refuse, however many men happen to be watching, and however few of them ever choose to move, to stay quiet yourself when it matters most. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, we would genuinely love to know what part of it stayed with you longest. And if you want more stories built exactly the way this one was, where the woman at the center is never just the one standing in danger, but the one who ends up holding the very truth that decides everything for everybody else in the room.